Something is building beneath Southern California right now, and a new stress study says it's worse than the public has been told. Beneath the orange groves of the Coachella Valley, beneath the freeways feeding into Los Angeles, beneath 10 million people going about an ordinary day, a fault line is locked, loaded, and quietly approaching a breaking point it hasn't reached in over 340 years. Scientists have a name for what's coming. They call it the Big One. And according to a 2026 stress analysis, the southern San Andreas is now accumulating strain at levels near a 1,000-year high. That's not a movie tagline, that's a measurement. The question is no longer whether this fault will rupture. The question is when, and whether you'll have time to react when it does. Let's start with the hard reality of what this fault actually is. The San Andreas is not a crack in the dirt. It's a roughly 800-mile-long scar that slices through the entire state of California, marking the exact boundary where two of the largest tectonic plates on Earth meet and grind against each other. On one side sits the Pacific Plate, on the other, the North American Plate. They are not gently touching. They are jammed together under colossal pressure, and they have been for millions of years. This is the seam of the planet running right through some of the most densely populated real estate in the United States. Here's the part most people misunderstand. The San Andreas is what geologists call a strike-slip fault. That means the two sides aren't moving up and down. They're sliding horizontally past one another. The Pacific Plate is creeping northwest. The North American Plate is creeping southeast. The rate? About 3.5 centimeters a year. That sounds almost laughably slow. It's roughly the speed your fingernails grow, but that motion never stops, and the fault doesn't move smoothly. In most places, it's locked. Friction holds the two sides in a death grip while the deep plate motion keeps pushing. The rock bends. It stores energy. It strains like a steel spring being wound tighter and tighter, and then eventually the friction loses. The locked fault snaps free in a violent instant, and decades or centuries of stored motion are released in seconds. That release is an earthquake. Now hold that image in your mind, a spring being wound tighter every single year, because the next number is the one that should make you sit up. The southern segment of the San Andreas, the stretch that runs from the Coachella Valley up through the Cajon Pass, has not produced a major rupture since roughly the year 1680. Read that again, 1680. That was before the United States existed. That was over 340 years ago. For more than 3 centuries, that section of fault has been locked tight while the plates kept pushing, kept winding the spring, kept loading strain into the rock with nothing to release it. 340 plus years of stored energy sitting under Palm Springs, sitting under the corridor that feeds Los Angeles, waiting. And the 2026 stress study flags this exact region, the area near the Cajon Pass, as accumulating stress at levels approaching a 1,000-year high. Let that land. Not a high for this decade, not a high for this century, a figure that, in the modeling, reaches toward the kind of stress accumulation you'd expect once in 1,000 years. The fault is more loaded today than at almost any point researchers can reconstruct. The spring is wound about as tight as the science can imagine it getting. To understand why this terrifies seismologists, you have to understand what this fault is capable of when it finally lets go. California has already shown the world twice. Go back to 1906. In the early morning hours, the northern San Andreas ruptured offshore and onshore near San Francisco. The magnitude was around 7.9. The shaking tore the city apart, and what the quake didn't level, the fires that followed did. Gas lines ruptured, water mains snapped, and flames swept through block after block while firefighters stood helpless with no water pressure. Around 3,000 people died. Much of San Francisco simply burned to the ground. That was the northern San Andreas speaking. Then go back even further, to 1857, to an event called the Fort Tejon earthquake. That one struck the central and southern portion of the fault. It also reached a magnitude near 7.9, and it ruptured an astonishing 225 miles of the fault line in a single event. 225 miles of earth tearing loose at once. The ground shifted by many feet in places. Fences that crossed the fault were offset. Riverbeds jumped sideways. The reason 1857 matters so much today is that it's the closest historical model we have for what scientists mean when they say the big one. It is the blueprint. And the section of fault that ruptured in 1857 sits dangerously close to the section that's been locked and loading since the 1600s. Now picture all of this happening today, but aimed straight at modern Southern California. That's exactly what a major scientific modeling exercise set out to simulate: a hypothetical magnitude 7.8 earthquake on the southern San Andreas, the kind that ruptures up from the Salton Sea region toward the heart of the metropolitan zone. The projected results are staggering. The model estimates roughly 1,800 deaths. It projects more than $200 billion in losses. And here's the detail that drives those numbers into the catastrophic range: proximity. This fault runs right past Palm Springs. It comes within about 35 miles of downtown Los Angeles. When a fault that powerful sits that close to that many people and that much infrastructure, the catastrophe math becomes brutal. There is no buffer of empty desert to absorb the worst of it. The shaking arrives in the dense urban core within seconds, and the energy that's been stored for 3.5 centuries doesn't ask whether the cities below are ready. So what actually happens in those first violent seconds? And why do some buildings stand while others pancake into the ground? That's where the real horror begins. Start with the water, because that's the part almost nobody pictures when they imagine a great California earthquake. They picture cracked freeways and crumbled towers. They don't picture the taps running dry for months. But that is exactly what the science warns could happen, and it comes down to a single brutal geographic fact. Southern California does not have its own water. It imports it. Roughly half of the region's supply travels hundreds of miles through a network of aqueducts: the Colorado River Aqueduct, the California Aqueduct, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, and every single one of those lifelines crosses the San Andreas Fault. Read that again. The water that keeps tens of millions of people alive has to physically cross the most dangerous fault in the country to reach them. When the ground slips sideways by several feet in a great rupture, those aqueducts don't bend gracefully. They shear. Concrete channels crack open. Pipelines snap at the crossing points. In a worst-case southern rupture, all 3 major aqueducts could be severed at once, in the same minute, by the same earthquake. And here's the part that turns a disaster into a slow-motion crisis. Repairing an aqueduct where it crosses an active fault is not a quick job. Engineers estimate it could take months to restore full water deliveries to the region. Months. Picture a metropolitan area of nearly 20 million people facing a summer with its imported water cut off at the source. The stored reserves help, but they don't last forever, and they were never designed to. And water is only the first domino. The same fault that carries the aqueducts also carries the fuel lines, the natural gas pipelines, the high-voltage power corridors, and the fiber optic and communication cables that stitch the region to the rest of the country. They all funnel through the same mountain passes because geography only gives engineers so many places to thread a pipeline. So when the fault moves, it doesn't break one system. It breaks them in parallel. Fuel pipelines rupture, gas mains tear. And remember 1906. Remember what ruptured gas did to a city with no water pressure to fight the fires. Power lines crossing the fault go down, and the grid that depends on them starts shedding load across the entire region. Communication cables snap, and in the most critical hour, when people most need to reach each other, the network goes dark. This is what seismologists mean when they use the word cascade. It's not one failure. It's a chain of failures, each one feeding the next. No water to fight fires started by broken gas lines. No power to run the pumps that might have moved what water remained. No fuel to keep the generators running at hospitals. No signal to coordinate the response. Each system was built to be reliable on its own, but they were never built to all fail at the same instant, along the same line in the earth, in the same 2 minutes of shaking. Now go back to those 2 minutes, because that's where the human toll is decided. Near the fault, in a great rupture, strong shaking could last 1 to 2 full minutes. Stop and actually count that out. Most people have never experienced even 10 seconds of violent ground motion. Imagine 60 seconds. Imagine 90. Imagine the floor heaving and rolling under you for longer than it takes to read this paragraph aloud. The walls flexing, the lights swinging, the sound of the structure groaning around you while you cannot stand, cannot walk, cannot do anything but hold on and wait for it to stop. And it does not stop. That duration is what kills buildings. A short, sharp jolt a structure can sometimes ride out, but a minute and a half of sustained, rhythmic shaking finds every weakness. It works at the cracks. It loosens the joints. It pushes a building past the point where it can recover its shape and then past the point where it can hold its own weight. And not all buildings are equal in that moment. This is the single most important thing to understand about who lives and who doesn't. The deadliest structures are already known. Engineers have a name for them. Non-ductile concrete buildings, the kind built before roughly 1980, before modern seismic codes, are at the top of the list. In these older concrete buildings, the steel reinforcement inside the columns isn't tied together the way modern code demands. When the shaking gets violent, the concrete shatters, the columns lose their grip, and the floors above come straight down, stacked, flat. That's the pancake collapse, and it is exactly the failure mode that kills the most people the fastest, because there's almost no survivable space left between the floors. Then there are the soft story apartments. You've seen them 1,000 times without knowing what you were looking at. They're the residential buildings where the ground floor is mostly open. Tuck under parking, big garage doors, a wall of windows for a storefront, with 2 or 3 stories of apartments stacked on top. That open ground floor has very little to resist the sideways push of an earthquake. So when the shaking comes, the bottom level folds. The upper floors drop down onto where the cars were parked, onto where the lobby was, and the people sleeping above ride the whole building down. Across Southern California, there are thousands of these structures, and tens of thousands of people live in them, often without ever realizing their home sits on the most vulnerable design there is. This is why 2 buildings on the same block can have completely different fates in the same earthquake. A modern, retrofitted, ductile structure flexes and survives. The pre-1980 concrete box beside it comes down. The difference isn't luck. It's engineering, age, and whether anyone spent the money to reinforce it before the fault decided to move. And that brings us to the technology now racing the shockwave itself, a system that can't stop the shaking, but might just give you the most valuable seconds of your life, if you know what it is and what to do when it speaks. That system is called Shake Alert. It's the Earthquake Early Warning Network now operating across the entire West Coast. And the way it works is a kind of race against physics. When a fault ruptures, it sends out 2 kinds of waves. The first, the P wave, travels fastest but does little damage. The second, the S wave, is the slow, violent shaking that brings buildings down. Shake Alert's sensors detect that harmless first wave the instant rupture begins, calculate the size and location in real time, and fire a warning ahead of the destructive shaking at the speed of a digital signal, far faster than the quake itself can travel through rock. What does that buy you? Sometimes only a handful of seconds, sometimes 10, 20, even more if you're far from the epicenter. It doesn't sound like much, but seconds are everything. Seconds are enough for a surgeon to lift the scalpel, enough for a train to brake before it hits a buckled rail, enough for an elevator to stop at the nearest floor and open its doors instead of trapping you between them, enough for you to drop, cover, and hold on before the floor starts moving. The warning can come to your phone, and when it does, it will not be subtle. It will scream. The instinct is to freeze and stare at it. Don't. The warning is the cue to act, not to watch. But here's the hard limit, and it's the reason borrowed time cuts both ways. If you are sitting almost directly over the southern San Andreas when it ruptures, Palm Springs, the Coachella Valley, the towns hugging the fault line, there may be no warning at all. The shaking and the alert arrive together because you're at the source. Shake Alert protects the cities downstream. It can't protect the ground at ground zero. The closer you are to the fault, the more you are on your own, and the more it matters that your home was built, or fixed, to stand up. And remember, the new study warns this rupture might not stay on the San Andreas at all. It could jump. The San Jacinto Fault runs parallel, close, threaded right through the inland cities of Southern California. In a multi-segment scenario, one fault triggers the other, and a single quake becomes a much larger one. More length, more energy, more cities caught in the strong shaking zone at once. That's the version seismologists quietly hope they never have to model in real life. So what do you actually do with all of this? Not panic. Panic is useless. Preparation is not. Start with the cheapest, highest value step there is. Strap your water heater to the wall studs. An unsecured water heater walks across the room in a big quake, snaps its gas line, and starts a fire. And fire, not falling concrete, did most of the damage in 1906. Anchor your tall furniture and bookcases to the wall so they can't topple onto you in the dark. Know where your gas shutoff is and keep a wrench beside it. And store water, real water, 2 weeks of it per person, because if those aqueducts crossing the fault snap, the taps could run dry for months while crews rebuild lines across a moving scar in the earth. 2 weeks of food, batteries, a flashlight, a way to charge a phone, a plan for where your family meets when the cell towers are overloaded. None of this is dramatic. All of it is what stands between a frightening night and a deadly one. Because here is the honest truth, the one the science actually supports. No one can tell you the day. Anyone who names a date is guessing, and they are wrong too. Earthquakes do not run on a calendar, but the southern San Andreas has not had a great rupture in over 340 years. The strain has been loading the whole time, silently, relentlessly, at roughly 3.5 centimeters a year, meter after meter of stored motion, locked into the rock, waiting for the moment the friction finally gives. The average gap between major southern quakes is far shorter than the gap we are already living in. The new stress study puts this exact stretch near Cajon Pass at a 1,000-year high. Seismologists are not arguing about whether the big one comes. They are confident it does, this century, on a fault that has been quiet for far too long. The only thing nobody can name is when. That's what borrowed time really means. Not a prediction, a debt. The ground beneath Southern California owes a motion it has been putting off for centuries. And one day, without warning to the people standing on top of it, that debt comes due. When it does, the difference between a disaster and a catastrophe won't be the fault. It'll be the buildings, the water, the warning. The choices made in the quiet years before, while there was still time to make them. So now the question turns to you. If a shake alert warning screamed from your phone right now, and you had 10 seconds before the strong shaking reached you, do you actually know where you'd go? And is your home one of the ones built to stand? Be honest in the comments. Have you secured your water heater and stored your 2 weeks of water? Or is that still on the list you keep meaning to get to? And do you live near the fault, Coachella, the Inland Empire, the LA Basin, or far enough out that the warning might actually reach you in time? Tell us where you are and what you've done to prepare, because the people reading your answer might be the ones who finally take the step that saves them. Subscribe and stay with this channel. When the ground moves, we'll be tracking it live, and you'll want to know what's happening before the next aftershock hits.